Hello, everyone. My name is Mariah Hinton, and today I'm going to be exploring the most complex organ in the human body, the brain. The presentation will break down the macroscopic regions of the brain, investigate the specialized lobes of the cerebrum, analyze the protective layer of the meninges, and trace the life cycle of the cerebral spinal fluid. Let's begin by looking at the four major anatomical divisions. Looking at slide 3, we establish the structural framework we use to categorize the brain. While it operates as an integrated system, it is functionally and embryonically organized into four major anatomical divisions. These anatomical divisions house the 6 core regions on our syllabus. Grouping them this way is incredibly helpful because the anatomy mirrors an evolutionary gradient, moving from our advanced conscious mind down to our fundamental survival mechanics. At the top of the hierarchy, we have the cerebrum. This is the largest and most evolutionary advanced division, comprising the left and right hemispheres and the outer cerebral cortex. This essentially is the seat of higher order cognition, where volitional movements, analytical thought, and complex memories, and conscious self-awareness take place. Next is the dicephalon. This division primarily houses the thalamus and the hypothalamus. You can think of the dicephalon as the brain's central processing and regulatory hub. It functions as an internal gatekeeper, filtering raw sensory information and constantly adjusting visceral baselines to preserve homeostasis. Next, at the base of the skull, is the cerebellum, in Latin known as the little brain. Although it accounts for only about 10% of the brain's total volume, it is packed with over half of the central nervous system's neurons. It acts as a dedicated processor that continuously monitors and fine-tunes motor coordination, posture, and spatial orientation. Finally, at the base of the spine, or at the top of the spinal cord, is the brainstem. The brainstem is composed of 3 interconnected structures: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. It serves as a vital dual role. It is the primary two-way highway for ascending and descending nerve tracts. It houses the autonomic reflex centers responsible for immediate life-sustaining functions like your heart rate and respiration. By conceptualizing the brain through these 4 distinct pillars, we can better appreciate how the central nervous system neatly segregates autonomic survival functions from complex conscious processing. With the layout in mind, let's move on to the cerebrum and explore how that functions. The cerebrum makes up the largest portion of the human brain. This is the seat of consciousness, thought, personality, sensory processing, and voluntary motor control. Structurally, it is divided into 2 cerebral hemispheres. A deep groove called the longitudinal fissure splits them down the middle. These hemispheres exhibit contralateral control, meaning your right hemisphere directs your left side of your body, and your left hemisphere directs the right side. They talk to each other through a massive bridge of over 200 million nerve fibers, called the corpus callosum. Let's talk about why the surface of the brain looks so wrinkly. That unique folded pattern is actually a genius piece of biological engineering. The architecture comes down to 2 terms, gyri and sulci. The gyri are the raised ridges or hills of the tissue, and the sulci are the shallow grooves or valleys in between them. The brain folds inward like this for a simple reason, to save space. If you unrolled a smooth brain, it wouldn't fit inside a human skull. By wrinkling up, The cortex multiplies its total surface area, allowing it to pack billions of extra processing neurons into a tight space. It's essentially how our body maximizes computer power without giving us a giant head. The dicephalon. This is the central core of the brain hidden underneath the cerebral hemispheres. Structurally, it's a tight, busy area containing four main parts: the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus, which helps the pineal gland for sleep cycles, and the subthalamus, which helps smooth out your movements. It works like the brain's main switchboard and control room. It acts as an unavoidable gateway. Every single piece of sensory information from your body, with the sole exception of smell, has to stop here first to be filtered and sorted before it can reach your conscious mind. It is the master regulator of your unconscious life. It is continuously monitoring your blood chemistry, fluid levels, and core temperature, acting as the primary bridge linking your nervous system directly to your endocrine hormone system. It ensures your conscious mind isn't flooded with background noise while keeping your body completely stable in the background. The upper half of the dicephalon is the thalamus. Think of the thalamus as the ultimate sensory routing station. Every single piece of sensory information, touch, sight, sound, and taste, must stop here first. The thalamus filters these signals and routes them to the correct cortical lobes for interpretation. It also plays a vital role in maintaining alertness and consciousness. The hypothalamus. Even though it's only about the size of an almond, this little area is basically the body's ultimate command center for survival. Its main job is keeping your body's internal environment perfectly balanced, no matter what is happening to you on the outside. It constantly checks your internal stats to manage a long list of essentials. It acts as your thermostat, making you sweat or shiver to control your temperature. It tracks your blood concentration to tell you when you're thirsty, monitors your fuel levels to tell you when you're hungry, and manages your sleep clock to tell you when it's time to go to sleep. At the same time, it is the direct bridge connecting your brain to your hormones. It sits right above the pituitary gland, giving it orders to release the chemicals that control your metabolism, growth, and stress levels. It even handles your fight or flight responses, tweaking your heart rate and blood pressure on the fly when you get startled or stressed. Basically, while you're busy thinking about your day, the hypothalamus is working in the background to make sure you stay alive and stable. Directly beneath the dicephalon begins the brainstem, starting with the midbrain. The midbrain handles raw sensory reflexes. For example, if a loud noise occurs or an object flies towards your eyes, the midbrain coordinates the involuntary reflex to turn your head or blink. It also contains pathways critical for maintaining alertness. Next down the brainstem is the pons, a word that literally translates to bridge in Latin. True to its name, it physically links the cerebellum to the rest of the brainstem and cerebrum. It acts as a massive relay station for motor and sensory tracts and houses centers that help smoothly regulate breathing rhythms. The medulla oblongata sits at the base of the skull, transitioning directly into the spinal cord. It is essential for survival because it controls our core autonomic functions. It houses the cardiovascular center, which constantly adjusts your heart rate, cardiac contraction force, and systemic blood pressure. Second, it contains the respiratory center, which sets the automated baseline rhythm of your lungs when you are resting or unconscious. The medulla coordinates vital involuntary reflexes that protect your airway, such as swallowing, coughing, and sneezing. Structurally, the medulla is also famous for a critical anatomical landmark called the discussion of the pyramids. On the front surface of the medulla The pyramids are two prominent vertical ridges made of high-speed motor tracks. These tracks carry voluntary movement commands straight down from your primary motor cortex. The word discusation simply means to intersect or cross over in the shape of an X. Right at the bottom edge of the medulla, roughly 90% of these descending motor fibers physically cross the midline over to the opposite side of the body. The crossover is the literal anatomical reason why the brain exhibits contralateral control, meaning your left hemisphere controls the muscles on the right side of your body and your right hemisphere controls the left. It explains why a clinical event like a stroke on the left side of the brain causes motor paralysis on the right side of the body. The medulla functions as a bridge between conscious intent and physical survival. Tucked behind the brainstem at the base of the skull is the cerebellum, or little brain. While it does not initiate movement, it is our premier motor optimizer. The cerebellum constantly tracks your balance, posture, and equilibrium. It compares what your brain intended to do with what your muscles are actually doing, fine-tuning your movements in real time so you can walk smoothly, type, or ride a bicycle. White and gray matter. If you were to look at a real cross-section of a brain, you would see a very distinct split between these two areas. The gray matter forms that thin outer shell along the surface. This is your main computing zone, where the heavy lifting happens. It is packed full of neuron cell bodies, which means it handles your conscious thoughts, forms your memories, and makes your decisions. The white matter sits right underneath that outer shell, filling the deeper parts of the brain. It looks lighter because of myelin, which is a fatty, protective, insulating substance wrapped around long nerve fibers. You can think of white matter like a high-speed internet connection or fiber optic cables. It doesn't do the actual thinking. Its job is just to route signals as fast as possible between different processing centers and down to the spinal cord. Let's look at the building blocks that make up our gray matter, where the brain's actual data processing happens. First, we have the neuronal cell bodies, or soma. This is the cell's core engine containing the nucleus, and it is responsible for producing all the energy and proteins the neuron needs. Next are the dendrites, which you can see in the image looking like tree branches. They act like biological antennas to receive incoming chemical signals from other neurons. These signals travel across the synapses, which are the microscopic gaps where neurons pass chemical messages to one another. Neurons can't survive alone, which brings us to glial cells, specifically astrocytes and microglia. They act as the vital support crew, keeping the environment stable, delivering nutrients, and protecting neurons from damage. Gray matter contains unmyelinated axons because they are short distance travelers, moving signals locally within the cortex. They don't require the heavy, fatty insulation found in white matter. The lobes of the cerebrum. As you can see from the color-coded diagram on the slide, each hemisphere of the cerebrum is anatomically divided into 4 distinct regions. They are named directly after the protective cranial bones that shield them from the outside world. We have the frontal lobe at the anterior front, the parietal lobe at the top in the middle, and the temporal lobe tucked on the lower side near your ears, and the occipital lobe anchoring the very back of the skull. While these lobes physically look like one continuous piece of tissue, they split up the brain's workload into specialized departments. We're going to start our breakdown of the individual lobes with the frontal lobe. As you can see from the mid-sagittal view on the left, this region takes up the entire anterior portion of your brain, sitting right behind your forehead. Think of the frontal lobe as the brain's executive suite. It is responsible for our most advanced cognitive functions, including decision-making, planning, focus, and working memory. It is also the seat of your personality, emotional regulation, and housing the impulse control centers that guide our behavior. Mechanically, the back edge of the lobe is incredibly important because it contains the primary motor cortex and motor planning areas. This is the structural command center that initiates and directs all voluntary skeletal muscle movements throughout your body. The frontal lobe also handles speech production via a specialized region known as the Broca's area. Essentially, this lobe controls both how we think and how we physically act on those thoughts. On slide 17, we have the parietal lobe, which sits directly behind the frontal lobe along the top and middle section of the skull. If the frontal lobe is about taking action, the parietal lobe is all about processing information. Its primary job is sensory perception and integration. At the very front edge of this lobe lies a vital strip of tissue called the primary somatosensory cortex. This area receives and maps out physical sensations from all over your body, including touch, pressure, temperature, and pain. Beyond basic touch, the parietal lobe works like an internal GPS. It is responsible for spatial awareness, helping you track where your body is in three-dimensional space and allowing you to navigate surroundings without bumping into things. It also plays a key role in mathematical processing, reading, and recognizing symbols. It takes the complex sensory inputs from the outside world and pieces them together in a unified map that you can actually understand. On slide 18, we examine the temporal lobe, which sits right underneath your temples near your ears. As you can see from the bullet points, this lobe is our primary hub for sound, language, and memory. First, it handles auditory processing. It houses the primary auditory cortex, meaning that it is the area responsible for interpreting sound pitch, music processing, and speech decoding. Second, it plays a role in memory formation. The temporal lobe interfaces directly with deeper structures to help convert your daily experiences into long-term memories. It also handles emotional association, which is why a specific song or a familiar scent can instantly trigger a vivid emotional memory. Finally, this lobe is responsible for language comprehension and object and face recognition. It helps you decode spoken words, retains verbal memory, and works through complex visual pathways to help you identify objects and recognize familiar faces. It is what makes sense of everything we hear and matches what we see with what we remember. Moving on to slide 19, we reach the occipital lobe, which anchors the very back of the cerebral cortex. While it is the smallest of the four lobes, its job is highly specialized. It is the brain's dedicated center for processing vision. At the core of this region sits the primary visual cortex, which acts as the direct destination for incoming information traveling from your eyes via the optic nerves. The occipital lobe handles visual perception. It doesn't just receive images, it instantly decodes them by determining orientation, mapping motion, and processing color and lines. It also handles object and spatial recognition. This means it evaluates spatial attributes, depth perception, and shapes so you can accurately judge distances and identify what you're looking at. Without this lobe, your eyes could collect light perfectly fine, but your mind wouldn't be able to make any sense of the images. This completes our tour of the four external lobes of the cerebrum. Moving on to slide 20, we shift our focus to a critical theme, protecting the brain. Now that we have covered the processing departments of the cerebral cortex, we have to talk about how the body actually keeps this delicate tissue safe. Neural tissue has almost no physical rigidity. It is incredibly soft and completely defenseless on its own. It cannot simply sit directly behind the hard, rough interior bone of your skull. Because of that, the body relies on a comprehensive, multi-layered defense system to isolate, stabilize, and cushion the central nervous system. Over the next few slides, we are going to look closely at the two main components of this defense system. First, the three structural tissue membranes known as the meninges, and second, the circulating fluid cushion known as the cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF. The meninges. As you can see on the diagram, these sheets are stacked sequentially. We have the tough dura mater on the outside, the web-like arachnoid matter in the middle, and the thin pia mater resting directly on the brain itself. Dura mater. The name literally translates from Latin as tough mother, and it completely lives up to that description. As you can see in the anatomical image, it is a thick, leathery, incredibly strong fibrous sheet. Because it is the outermost layer of the meninges, it fuses directly to the inner periosteum of the cranial bones, which are labeled here as calvarium. This tight connection anchors the brain to the skull, keeping it from shifting around during sudden head movements. You can also see the branches of the middle meningeal artery running along the surface, which is a major blood vessel supplying the dura itself. Arachnoid matter. It gets its spider web-like name from the delicate network of collagen and elastic fibers you can see in the diagram. This layer is defined by the subarachnoid space that sits directly underneath it, right between the arachnoid membrane and the deeper pia mater. This space is filled with circulating cerebral spinal fluid, which acts as a liquid shock absorber to cushion the brain. Pia mater is the deepest and final layer of our protective shield. The name translates from Latin to tender mother, which fits perfectly because of its micro, thin, incredibly delicate membrane. Unlike the other two layers, the pia mater doesn't just stretch over the top of the brain's curves. It is bound tightly to the tissue, following every single fold, gyrus, and sulcus on the surface like a tight plastic wrap. The pia is highly vascularized, meaning it is packed with blood vessels. It acts as a protective, stabilizing scaffold for these vessels as they travel along down to the surface and dive deep down into the brain tissue to drop off nutrients and oxygen. The route cerebral spinal fluid takes as it flows and protects the central nervous system. Fresh CSF leaves the lateral ventricles, passing through the third and fourth ventricles before spilling out into the subarachnoid space to wrap around the brain and spinal cord. It serves two roles. It provides buoyancy so the brain floats, and it works like a liquid shock absorber against physical impact. Old fluid travels up to the top of the skull to be recycled. It passes through the arachnoid granulations, those little one-way valves we talked about earlier, and empties directly into dural venous sinuses. From there, it safely mixes back into your venous blood circulation. This constant production and reabsorption loop is critical because it replaces your entire fluid supply multiple times a day, keeping intracranial pressure perfectly balanced.